Well, howdy there, folks. James, Political Friar, coming to you again. I got the LSE hat on, and so we're going to have an international relations topic today, although it has a domestic politics tie in because it was domestic U.S. politics that have caused a change in our topic for today, and that's going to be Russia and Ukraine and how the incoming Trump administration is likely to affect their conflict, but more importantly, how the parties, Russia and Ukraine themselves, are likely to see Trump's impact. And this is interesting in particular because Trump doesn't tell people exactly what he intends to do. Maybe he doesn't know exactly what he intends to do on big topics like this. He is making policy with a little bit more gut than mind, I think, and that has interesting effects on the parties that are trying to predict what's going on. So let's talk about Trump from Ukraine's perspective. The conventional knowledge is that a Trump election is bad for Ukraine. It will cause the United States to retrench and retreat. And I think that is by and large correct, but there are some caveats. See, Trump doesn't like losing either. He negotiated a treaty with the Taliban that absolutely abandoned Afghanistan to the Taliban. And then when the natural consequences of the treaty came to pass under the Biden administration, he criticized Biden for not launching airstrikes against the Taliban, which would have been in violation of the very treaty that Trump negotiated. And I think Trump would have launched airstrikes against the Taliban. I think he would have broke his word, whereas Biden ironically kept Trump's word. Well, that was a mistake on Biden's part, one that I don't think Trump would have any trouble just reneging on. And so if there is a forced settlement that Trump negotiates directly with Russia, leaving Ukraine out in the cold the same way he left Afghanistan out in the cold. If the Russians then take advantage of it or then are able to face Ukraine without American opposition, I think Trump will just renege on it. I think he'll just say, no, no, no. You guys all agreed to stop fighting, and I mean that you should stop fighting. And it's kind of the big brother approach to Ukraine, and Russia as the little brother. And so I think that sort of on that fundamental level, the Ukrainians won't be entirely abandoned by the Americans. I just don't think that's going to happen because Trump doesn't want to lose. He is absolutely obsessed with his legacy and with his place in history. He wears his 45, 47 hats now, I have no doubt. And that kind of you lost Ukraine thing is the type of smear that has chased Harry Truman around when he lost China. It chased Nixon around when he lost Vietnam, and it will absolutely chase Biden around for losing Afghanistan, even though Trump certainly helped with that. So I think there is a bit of a hedge there. The U.S. policy has been pretty much to make sure that neither side really wins in this conflict. It benefits the United States to have Russia not win, and also it benefits the United States to have Russia not lose. That might end up being where we are under the Trump administration for that reason, too. Second, the Russians. Well, the Russians think that Trump will impose a settlement on them, or really on the Ukrainians. They're not imposing a settlement on the Russians, but the Russians believe that the Trump administration has two things that it wants to do. That it wants the fighting to come to an end, roughly where the current lines are, and the Russians believe that the Trump administration can make that happen. And so the Russians are doing something which, under other circumstances, is militarily idiotic. The Russians have launched a massive offensive in the middle of the muddy season in Eastern Europe. This is a major no-no. They are going to get tens of thousands of Russians killed for nothing, but not nothing. They might find themselves a couple miles further west than they would have been otherwise. And if Trump freezes the conflict before their losses become catastrophic or before they have to reconstitute and defend themselves from a counteroffensive from the Ukrainians, well, lives well spent. So the Russians are in the process of aggressively shooting their bolt. They have launched a massive attack on Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are defending it relatively easily, as you would expect, based on the weather. But the Russians are making very small progress, and that very small progress, assuming that they never have to pay the bill for the debt that they're incurring by burning through their units and equipment at a rate that is absolutely unsustainable, is fine, because Trump will cause peace. And you want to time your maximum effort to align with the moment of peace, right? It doesn't make any sense to leave bullets in the chamber once the shooting stops. And so the Russians are engaged in a gamble. If Trump doesn't, for some reason, impose a peace on Ukraine, well, Ukraine's going to be looking pretty good by the spring. The Ukrainian military has largely reconstituted itself. It's dealt with its manpower problem through a draft. They are extending their training period from 4 to 9 weeks. The Ukrainians are likely to be okay by spring, assuming that the American funding that has already passed just keeps coming. You don't need new funding for the Ukrainians to be okay into next summer. You just need the stuff that was already passed to keep going. Trump needs to not stop that. And there's some question about whether Trump can stop it. I probably can, but it has momentum and it has the force of law. And maybe Trump's going to be distracted by other things, and it might just roll through the bureaucracy at the Department of Defense such that Ukrainians keep getting it. So the Russians, if they're right, are going to get a couple more square kilometers of Ukrainian territory before Trump freezes the conflict and forces some kind of resolution. And if the Russians are wrong, well, they may find themselves in a worse spot than they thought based off of Trump's either lack of interest or inattention. The Ukrainians are probably right in that Trump is less invested in their actual success, but they might be wrong in the idea that he's at all invested in Russia's success. I don't think he is. And so you're seeing in Ukraine now a incredible intensifying of the fighting on the presumption that Trump's going to do something. The interesting scenario, counterfactual, is what if he doesn't? What if he just does nothing? If he does nothing, well, the Russians have lost their gamble that they are playing out now. They're going to be far worse off in the spring than they would have been under a Biden administration or a Harris administration, because they wouldn't have launched this offensive. This offensive into the middle of the mud and the guns, that the Ukrainians are just murdering Russians at a rate that is unprecedented. The Russian losses are higher in the last month than they've been ever in this war. And the Ukrainian losses are actually about the same. They're just attacking into a time period where you shouldn't be attacking. And we've talked about the mud in Eastern Europe before, so I won't redo it, but that's to say you don't fight in November and you don't fight in January or in February in Eastern Europe. You sit because you can't move. Anyway, the next factor with Ukraine and Russia and Trump is a decoupling from Europe. Now, Europe has been talking about decoupling strategically from the United States for literal decades. The idea of an EU army is something that Macron in particular has been interested in, and it's because the Europeans are worried, it turns out rightly, that they can't rely on the Americans. The Americans are untrustworthy. Well, yeah, I guess that's probably true, because Trump will probably continue to decouple the United States strategically from Europe. That doesn't mean he's going to withdraw from NATO. It doesn't mean that he's going to stop selling weapons. Goodness knows he's going to keep selling weapons to NATO. But it does mean that whatever vigorous support that the Europeans might have otherwise expected, well, it'll at least be toned down. And Trump is going to be making demands on them left, right, and center. And one of the demands that the Europeans have heard the most is they have to spend X dollars on their defense budget. And that usually is said to be 2% of GDP. That's pretty low in historical terms. Frankly, the United States at 3.5% of its GDP is pretty low in historical terms. The Russians are spending 40% of their GDP on the military, and the Ukrainians are too. That is a wartime economy, but it is sustainable for a period of time. And the Europeans and the Americans just aren't in that commitment. Well, if the Americans truly decouple, it isn't impossible to imagine the Europeans freaking the F out and deciding that they actually have to build a military to oppose Russia. Now, I'd argue that that's bad for America. Having another geostrategic military power in the world that it could say no to America when previously they didn't have the ability to say no is a net loss for this country. But it might also be a net loss for Russia because Europeans, if they truly do invest in their military and in defense, might be able to just replace the American aid. Actually, they could. If they chose to, the Europeans certainly could replace the American aid. Now, the industrial power that the Europeans would have to access would have to be American, and so the Americans would have to be willing to sell to the Europeans, but it would be selling to the Europeans for Ukraine's benefit. If the Ukrainians, are on the verge of collapse and the Europeans decide that it's worth it, well, yeah, they could afford it. The European economy is 10 times bigger than Russia's. It wouldn't be that much of a strain to defeat Russia for Europe alone. Now, they might not. There are various elements in Europe that genuinely would like to see Russia win. There are other elements in Europe that are indifferent, and then there are even larger elements who simply want to put their head in the ground and not worry about it. All this is to say that a Trump election is probably not what the Ukrainians were rooting for, but might not work out the way the Russians were looking to see it either. I guess we're just going to have to see. Uh, it's it's going to be an interesting next couple months. Look for the peace initiative, if there is one, to get started in February during the second muddy season, and look for the Russians to just have tens of thousands of young Russian men, or as few Russian men as possible. They'll try to get North Koreans to come, die on the front in Ukraine, attacking prepared defenses through the mud. It's brutal. It's going to be a slaughter, and it's sad. Anyway, it's just a thought. Let me know how wrong I am in the comments down below. Leave me a like, hit that subscribe button. Next videos, we're going to talk about the election, how and why and what and who and what happened. But it's taken me quite a while just to digest things. And I didn't want to come on here with a half-baked analysis without really deciding, what I think actually happened. So look for that University of Oregon hat to come along here in a bit. But this one was a topic that I don't think you were going to get commentary from on the rest of the news, and it was fairly easy to see how it was going to play out. It was relatively well predicted ahead of time. All right, well, that's it. I appreciate you. Bye.